What if everything you've ever called a breakdown was actually a breakthrough? What if the anxiety, the isolation, the darkness you feared were not signs of failure, but sacred steps in your becoming? Most people don't survive their spiritual awakening not because they are weak, but because awakening demands the death of everything false and the courage to stand naked in the truth. The collapse of the persona is the first and most jarring threshold of spiritual awakening. The persona is the mask an individual wears to navigate society, shaped by roles, expectations, cultural ideals, and the unconscious desire to be accepted. It is not the true self, but a carefully constructed illusion that allows a person to function within a structured world. Most people believe their persona is who they are. They say, "I am a doctor," or "I am a mother," or "I am successful," and in doing so bind their identity to the outer shell. But the spiritual awakening disrupts this illusion with a force that cannot be reasoned with. A person begins to feel an emptiness in everything they once found meaningful. The job no longer provides satisfaction. The relationships that once gave comfort now feel hollow. The carefully planned life feels like a script written by someone else. This is not a crisis of circumstance, but a crisis of identity. The persona begins to crack, revealing that it was never the essence of the individual, only a facade maintained for survival. This collapse can manifest as depression, existential dread, or a deep sense of confusion. The psyche, once anchored by routines and societal validation, begins to drift into unknown waters. Many interpret this as a breakdown rather than a breakthrough, because they are losing the very image they believed was real. In this stage, everything that was once stranger to themselves now feels alien. The individual becomes a stranger to themselves. The opinions of others lose their grip, not because they no longer matter, but because the awakening soul begins to see through their unreality. There is no more interest in pretending, but there is also no clarity on what lies beyond the mask. This in-between place is terrifying. One is no longer the person they used to be, but they have not yet become who they truly are. Few survive this stage because it demands a surrender of all false identities. The persona is not just a social mask, it is a psychological armor. Without it, one feels exposed, vulnerable, and unsafe. This vulnerability is not weakness, but the beginning of authenticity. However, it can feel like death. The ego mourns the loss of its roles. The world becomes disorienting. The individual can no longer rely on the old motivations of ambition, validation, or conformity. Many will try to rebuild the persona, to return to their former life, even if it means spiritual stagnation. They will convince themselves they were simply going through a phase or burned out. But something has been seen, something that cannot be unseen. The awakening has begun, and the collapse of the persona is the soul's invitation to step beyond illusion. Most turn back here, not because they are weak, but because the pain of shedding the mask feels unbearable. They do not yet know that what lies beneath is far more real, far more powerful than any image the world once applauded. Confrontation with the shadow is the most unsettling phase of spiritual awakening because it involves meeting the repressed, denied, and unacknowledged aspects of the self. The shadow is not just darkness or evil. It is the totality of everything a person refuses to see in themselves. Anger, jealousy, fear, guilt, arrogance, neediness, even potential and power that have been buried due to shame or societal conditioning. During a spiritual awakening, the thin walls separating the conscious identity from the unconscious begin to dissolve, and the contents of the shadow start to surface. This emergence is not gentle. It is chaotic, emotionally raw, and deeply destabilizing. A person may suddenly be overtaken by feelings they don't recognize, intrusive thoughts they are ashamed of, or impulses they believed they had transcended. The polished image of the self begins to distort, and what emerges is not a monster but a mirror, reflecting everything they have run from. This process often evokes disgust, denial, or terror. The individual wonders how such darkness could reside within them. They may project it onto others, accusing the world of betrayal, cruelty, or falseness, without realizing that the world is merely reflecting their own unconscious back to them. The shadow is not external. It is internalized and hidden for so long that when it rises, it feels foreign. Many flee at this point. They seek distractions, numb themselves, or cling to spiritual bypassing, pretending to be above anger or untouched by desire in an attempt to avoid facing the truth of their own humanity. The discomfort is too great. They were taught to be kind, righteous, controlled, perfect. They were not taught how to rage, how to mourn, how to hold the contradictions within them without collapsing. To confront the shadow is to enter the underworld of the psyche. Myths of ancient heroes descending into darkness echo this exact process. It is never glamorous. It is dirty, brutal, and often lonely. The awakening individual is stripped of illusions, stripped of moral superiority, and forced to reckon with who they really are, not who they pretend to be. Yet in this darkness lies the key to transformation. The shadow, when integrated, becomes a source of strength, wisdom, and wholeness. But before that, it must be seen, it must be named, it must be embraced without judgment. This is where most fail, not because the journey is impossible, but because it is excruciatingly honest. It exposes everything that has been buried, and there is no shortcut through it. The confrontation with the shadow is not a single event, but a continual process. Each layer peeled back reveals another, deeper one. The more one resists it, the more violent its appearance becomes. Those who endure this stage without being consumed by shame or fear begin to reclaim their inner power. But those who avoid it will remain trapped, repeating cycles of unconscious behavior, forever haunted by the very parts of themselves they refuse to face. The loneliness of liberation is one of the most profound yet painful realities of spiritual awakening. As the illusions fall away and the soul begins to see with new eyes, the distance between the awakened individual and the sleeping world grows. This is not loneliness in the ordinary sense of lacking company. It is a deeper, existential solitude that arises when one no longer finds resonance with the conversations, values, or desires that once felt so familiar. The individual begins to see how much of society operates on unconscious patterns, chasing status, approval, distraction, and this new awareness isolates them from the collective rhythm. The very act of awakening creates a chasm between who they are becoming and the world they once belonged to. Friends may no longer understand them. Family may interpret their transformation as withdrawal or instability. Relationships that were once effortless begin to feel strained, not out of judgment, but because the foundational connection has been altered. The awakened soul starts to crave authenticity, depth, and silence. They lose interest in superficial exchanges, performative roles, and societal expectations. This withdrawal is not always intentional, but becomes necessary for survival, because exposure to the inauthentic world begins to feel like noise to a mind now attuned to truth. Yet this same withdrawal births a grief that is hard to articulate. It is the grief of losing belonging. The longing to connect does not vanish, but it becomes more refined. The individual no longer desires just any company. They yearn for presence, for depth, for realness, and that, in a world largely asleep, is rare. The silence grows louder, the inner world becomes richer, but the outer world feels more distant. The paradox is that the more awake one becomes, the fewer people there are who can meet them in that clarity. Many people cannot endure this loneliness. They seek to return to the herd, to reattach to their old identity, to pretend they didn't see what they saw. They will call it balance, maturity, or practicality, but deep down it is a retreat from the discomfort of being alone in their knowing. The awakened path can feel like exile, not by force, but by truth. This is why mystics have always wandered deserts and climbed mountains. It wasn't to escape the world, but because the world could no longer hold the truth they carried. The spiritual journey strips a person not only of illusions, but of companions who still live within them. One is left with silence, with self, with the vastness of the unknown. There are moments of beauty, of communion with something eternal, but also long stretches of desolation, where the soul whispers into the void, unsure if anything will answer back. In this sacred loneliness, there is also a gift. A deeper relationship with oneself begins to form. The presence that others cannot offer is slowly found within. Still the ache of separation lingers. Most people cannot survive this solitude because they do not yet realize that it is not abandonment, but initiation. Ego resistance and fear of annihilation emerge as central forces of obstruction during spiritual awakening. The ego, which has long governed the structure of identity, control, and perceived reality, is suddenly faced with the threat of its own dissolution. Awakening is not merely about gaining insight or peace, it is about the unraveling of the ego's authority. The deeper one moves into awareness, the more the ego tightens its grip, sensing the end of its dominance. This creates a psychological battlefield. The ego does not vanish willingly. It fights through fear, confusion, and subtle sabotage. It whispers thoughts of self-doubt, paints awakening as madness, and even disguises itself in spiritual clothing to maintain influence. People begin to say, "I am awakened," not realizing that the I making that claim is the ego in a new costume. It uses pride, superiority, and knowledge to create a new identity that still centers around the self-image. This resistance is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it appears as exhaustion, emotional numbness, or an intense need to return to the comforts of routine. The ego fears annihilation because it equates its own death with the death of the individual. But in truth, it is only the false self that is dying. The awakening self, which is deeper and more expensive, is untouched. Yet this truth is not easily accepted. The ego has spent a lifetime building walls of defense, constructing narratives, and anchoring identity in external validation. To let go of all that feels like standing on the edge of a cliff with no guarantee of what lies beyond. Fear becomes the weapon of choice. The mind floods with questions. Who will I be without this? What if I lose everything? What if I'm wrong? These are not just abstract thoughts. They are visceral, paralyzing sensations in the body. The ego stirs old traumas, unresolved wounds, and subconscious fears, using them as chains to pull the individual back from the edge of transformation. It creates scenarios of failure, abandonment. The person may begin to experience panic attacks, insomnia, emotional breakdowns, all of which are signs not of failure, but of the ego's desperate last stand. Some spiritual seekers fall into illusion during this stage. They begin to chase techniques, teachers, or systems, not to surrender the ego, but to strengthen it in more refined ways. They believe enlightenment is something to possess, something to add to the self. But true awakening is subtraction, not addition. The fear of ego death prevents them from entering that unknown space where the self is no longer bound by history, labels, or identity, and so they circle the truth, orbiting around it, unable to fall into it. What most do not realize is that the annihilation the ego fears is not destruction, but expansion. The self that emerges beyond ego is vast, connected, and whole. But to reach it, one must endure the death of what they once called me. This is why so few survive the passage, because the courage required to face this inner death feels greater than any outer suffering they have ever known. Addiction to the external world is one of the most powerful forces that keeps people from surviving their spiritual awakening. From birth, individuals are conditioned to look outward for meaning, identity, and validation. They are taught to chase achievement, seek approval, accumulate possessions, and immerse themselves in entertainment. This external focus becomes a way of life, a rhythm so deeply ingrained that silence feels unnatural, and solitude feels like punishment. Awakening threatens this entire structure. It invites a turning inward, a withdrawal from the noise, and a confrontation with the inner emptiness that has long been masked by outer distractions. But this is where the fear begins to surface, because most people don't truly know who they are without the mirror of the world reflecting something back at them. The modern world is expertly designed to numb that inner call. Every time the soul stirs, there is a screen to stare at, a notification to respond to, a product to desire, or a problem to solve. There is always somewhere to go, someone to please, something to fix. The pace of modern life leaves no room for stillness, because in stillness the deeper self begins to speak. That voice is not loud, but it is persistent. It asks difficult questions, questions the ego cannot answer, and the external world cannot silence for long. Yet, rather than face those questions, people reach for comfort, for noise, for motion. The discomfort of being alone with their own thoughts is enough to drive them back into the familiar cycle of consumption and escape. When the spiritual awakening begins, this addiction becomes more visible. A person may find themselves suddenly disinterested in the things that once gave them pleasure, but instead of embracing the shift, they panic. They think something is wrong. They try to revive old habits, cling to routines, or throw themselves deeper into distractions. The soul, however, is no longer satisfied with surface experiences. It longs for meaning, for presence, for depth. But reaching that depth requires sitting in the void, in the silence where nothing outside can rescue them. This space feels terrifying to the mind addicted to stimulation. It feels like dying, like losing control, like becoming invisible. But in truth, it is the beginning of freedom. Few are willing to endure this withdrawal. They treat awakening like a crisis rather than a calling. They go back to the familiar, to the fast-moving current of society, and pretend they never glimpsed anything beyond it. Others may seek spirituality as just another form of consumption, turning to practices, books, and teachers in the same way they once turned to social media or shopping, hoping to feel better without changing the structure of their inner life. But awakening is not about feeling better. It is about becoming whole, and wholeness requires that one relinquish the constant need for external affirmation. The addiction to the external is not broken easily. It demands discipline, courage, and a willingness to feel empty before one can feel full in a new way. Most do not survive this stage because the silence terrifies them more than the chaos ever did. Lack of inner framework or mythic understanding is one of the most overlooked yet critical reasons why most people never survive their spiritual awakening. The human psyche is not designed to undergo deep transformation in a vacuum. It requires symbolic structure, metaphoric language, and archetypal meaning to navigate the chaos of inner change. When a spiritual awakening begins, the inner world erupts with forces that are vast, mysterious, and often terrifying. Without a map, the individual becomes lost. They experience visions, emotional upheavals, synchronicities, and profound insights, but they have no context for what these experiences mean. Without a mythic lens, what is sacred feels like madness, and what is transformative is misinterpreted as something broken. Modern culture, in its obsession with rationalism and materialism, has stripped away the language of soul. There are no rites of passage, no shared narratives of inner rebirth, no communal guidance for descent into the unconscious. In ancient times, initiates undergoing spiritual transformation were guided by elders, symbols, dreams, and mythological stories that mirrored their journey. These stories didn't just entertain, they helped the individual interpret their suffering, make sense of their losses, and recognize the value of their pain. Today, when someone experiences the death of their ego or the eruption of unconscious content, there is no myth to catch them, no symbolic ground to hold them. So, they fall. This absence of symbolic understanding leads to fear, confusion, and often pathologization. A person undergoing a spiritual awakening may be told they are mentally ill, depressed, or unstable. In truth, they are experiencing the unraveling of their false self, the beginning of their true self's emergence. But without a framework to understand that death precedes rebirth, they resist, panic, and shut down the process. The psyche needs language to process experience. Without archetypes to lean on, the images and emotions that arise become overwhelming. They cannot be integrated because they cannot be named. They float in the unconscious, growing in intensity, destabilizing the conscious mind. Many people mistake awakening for transcendence. They believe it is about rising above the human condition rather than descending into its depths. They want light without shadow, peace without chaos, clarity without confusion. But all true myths speak of the descent, the sacrifice, the dark night of the soul. These are not detours. They are essential stages of awakening. Without this mythic awareness, individuals expect comfort when they should expect crucifixion, and when the suffering comes, they think they have failed, not realizing they are exactly where they need to be. The lack of symbolic structure also isolates the individual. They believe no one else has gone through what they are experiencing, unaware that countless souls across history have walked this same path in different forms. A mythic framework connects the personal to the universal. It turns personal suffering into sacred initiation. Without it, the awakening feels meaningless, terrifying, and directionless. The person loses the thread and often returns to the known world, scarred and confused, never realizing they were in the middle of becoming whole. The reason most people never survive their spiritual awakening is not because the path is impassable, but because the soul's journey demands a descent into everything the ego has avoided. The collapse of the persona strips away identity. The confrontation with the shadow unearths buried truths. The loneliness of liberation severs familiar ties. The ego resists with terror, fearing its own death. The addiction to external noise drowns the call of the inner world, and without a mythic framework to hold their experience, the awakened often feel lost, judged, or broken. But those who survive, who surrender to the chaos without numbing or retreating, emerge reborn, not as an idealized version of themselves, but as something far more authentic. They carry within them the wisdom of death and resurrection. They live not from the surface, but from the center, and in that center there is power, peace, and purpose the world cannot give and cannot take away.